Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to a conversation that sits at the very crossroads of poetry, politics, and the modern Muslim imagination. In the intellectual history of the subcontinent, the 20th century did not speak merely in prose, manifestos, or treaties. It spoke through the rhythm of Urdu verse. And at the summit of this landscape stands the colossal figures whose shadows continue to define our collective conscience. Allama Iqbal and Ahmad Faiz. At first glance, their worlds appear completely irreconcilable. On one side stands Iqbal, the philosopher of Khudi, the prophet of spiritual resurrection, the metaphysical visionary who looked up at the heavens and demanded that man arise to meet his creator as an equal sovereign of his own destiny. For Iqbal, emancipation was vertical, an ascent into divine selfhood, an awakening of the soul from the slumber of colonial decadence. And then history turned its page, and from the ashes of imperial retreat emerged Ahmad Faiz. Faiz descended from Iqbal's celestial peaks directly into the prison cells, the dust-choked alleys, and the blood-stained streets of post-colonial state. Where Iqbal was transcendental, metaphysical, and pan-Islamic, Faiz was grounded Marxist and intensely humanistic. Where Iqbal wielded thunderous cadence of eagle, Faiz cloaked revolution in the tenders, wounded vocabulary of the beloved. If Iqbal gave us the fire of longing, the burning desire for human dignity, it was Faiz who carried the sacred fire into the cold winter of political tyranny. How do two seemingly antithetical titans converse across time, faith, ideology, and political struggle? How do we read Iqbal through Faiz and Faiz through Iqbal without flattening either into dogma? To decode this profound intellectual and poetic dialogue, we are joined today by a brilliant scholar whose work bridges South Asian intellectual history, religion, and literature. I mean Dr. Abdul Manan Bhat, faculty at Harvard University. Today, we have the distinct privilege of introducing Dr. Abdul Manan Bhat, an accomplished Kashmiri scholar, academic, and writer whose work beautifully bridges the worlds of intellect, mysticism, and literature. Currently on the faculty at Harvard University across both the Department of South Asian Studies and the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, Dr. Manan guides students through the rich landscapes of Urdu and Indo-Persian literatures, Sufism, and the Islamic intellectual tradition. A former Penn Presidential Fellow, he earned his PhD in religious studies from the University of Pennsylvania, building on an academic foundation in religious studies and international relations from Lafayette College. As a scholar specializing in devotional literature, material religion, and Persianate world, Dr. Bhatt is currently working on his forthcoming book, Divine Craft, Poetry, Bodies, and Islam in Modernity, an ambitious project exploring sacred knowledge and literary practice across Persian, Arabic, Urdu, Hindi, and Kashmiri traditions. Beyond his rigorous scholarly contributions and publications in leading international journals, Dr. Manan is also a gifted creative voice, writing Urdu poetry under the pen name Allama. Please join me in welcoming a distinguished thinker, educator, and poet, Dr. Abdul Manan Bhat. So here it's how we go. We are asking our first question, or rather I can say I'm going to simply delve into my first curiosity by asking this question. Scholars often treat Iqbal and Faiz as antithetical due to their stances on religion and Marxism. So Dr. Saab, how do you conceptualize their continuity between Iqbal's Khudi and Faiz's Inqilab?
Well, this is a very important question. First, I think what's quite, as you rightly pointed out, that one of the trends in scholarship often has been, or even in popular culture, that Iqbal perhaps seems to belong in a category of his own. He seems to be, even in popular representations, if you see across South Asia, he often appears by himself. He appears in deep thought, oftentimes in what we may call solitude.
Exactly. Even the pictures of Iqbal are simply portrayed like that.
Yes, exactly. And this has been one of the pressing points of my research to point out that Iqbal was not just in his poetry, but also in his life, quite a social man. This is one thing we know about him significantly, in significant detail. Anybody who's read the things written about Iqbal by his contemporaries or his juniors, I would refer, for example, to Sayyid Nazir Niazi's very important source on Iqbal called Iqbal ke Huzur mein, which he wrote in the year of Iqbal's passing. And it's basically his conversations with other people, including Iqbal. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that Iqbal in his life and of course in his poetry was consistently surrounded by people, was surrounded by those who came before him, was surrounded by those who wanted to learn from him. He was an important and social man. And one of the things we get from these sources is that his house was always filled with people. It was open to any and everybody. This is something that people repeatedly stress. In fact, both Nazir Niazi and later Wahid Khan, Sufi Tabassum, all of them would mention and point out one thing, that you could go to Iqbal's house pretty much at any time of the day. He would be sitting on his charpai, and you could find professors and tanga pullers who would just come and sit with and listen to it. He was quite a social person, would talk to people, what we may call jumlebaz. He was someone like that. But you see, when you look at the popular representations, that's not something that you get. Now, in his poetry, Iqbal is severely dialogical. What I mean by that is he is consistently in conversation with poets who came before him, with the poets of the Islamic world, poets of the European world, his contemporaries, and of course, he is also talking to generations that have not been born yet. Heavily dialogical. So what happens with these popular perceptions is that we tend to isolate Iqbal both from his material world and also in his intellectual dealings. Now, why I started with this is because this is the logical consequence of that has been what you described, which is to say that someone like Faiz, who not only had met Iqbal on multiple occasions, was, in his own words, extremely indebted to Iqbal's attempt in poetry and for poetic form, and yet we tend to put them in some sort of an opposition because of these political and ideological, supposed political and ideological differences.
The different narratives.
Yeah,
they
but one of the
represented,
best one of the best things about Iqbal, and one of the, I would say, I've spent quite a lot of time looking at people talk about Iqbal, write about Iqbal, his contemporaries. So I not only read Iqbal, I try to read whatever was written about him by people who knew him, by people who engaged him. One of the most searing parts and portions was written by Faiz. Faiz wrote significantly about Iqbal on different occasions. I can go into the details of those. For example, he did a manzoom tarjuma, versified translation of Bayan-e-Mashriq from Persian into Urdu. And Faiz did it, of selections. It was published in the 70s. And he also wrote its introduction. The sentence that Faiz wrote, he said that, I'll say it in Urdu, it's quite important. You know how we refer to Iqbal as Maktaba Fikr, Maktaba Fikr ke hamil. He represents a school of thought. Faiz wrote a very keen sentence and he said, Iqbal ek Maktaba Fikr nahi, ek danishgah hai. You see, he overturns, and I think it's a very important insight. Faiz himself overturns this idea that Iqbal represents one consistent ideological position. So rather, he flips this and uses and plays with this term Maktaba Fikr to say Iqbal ek danishgah hai. Just like in a university, there are many schools.
Exactly, yes.
So Iqbal is that. These are Faiz's words. So Faiz understood Iqbal quite, I think, at the level at which Iqbal is supposed to be understood. Which is both his contributions and the political possibilities in his poems, the emotional possibilities in his poems, and also the lyrical possibilities in his poems. We should not forget that Iqbal is perhaps one of the most lyrical poets of Urdu and also of Persian poetry in early modernity and colonial modernity. You see, Faiz wrote a very moving poem, a qasida. उन्होंने इकबाल के लिए रखा, नजर इकबाल. Now, you see, I'm going to quote a few lines from that, and you'll see what I mean with the way in which Faiz saw Iqbal and what he thought Iqbal represented. So you may have heard some lines of it, but there's some quite moving. And it goes something like, आया हमारे देश में एक खुशनवा फकीर, आया और अपनी धुन में गजल खां गुजर गया. And it moves very beautifully through the various aspects of Iqbal's poetic personality. और वो आखिर में, towards the end, it has, I think, one of the most moving lines written about Iqbal. He says, न उसका गीत सबके दिलों में उतर गया, ये गीत मिसले शोलाए जब वाला तुंद तेज, इसकी लपक से बादे फना का जिगर गुदाज, जैसे चराग वहशते सरसर से बेखतर, या शम में बज़्म सुबह की आमद से बेनियाज.
So very nice.
Right? And so what I'm trying to place here is, and what I try to do in my research is to really rethink these received categories of socialism or of, whether it's Islamism and so on and so forth that we often ascribe these to. And I place Faiz and Iqbal in the Islamic intellectual and ethical tradition, the pinnacle of which is poetry. And if you like, I actually want to point out something here about Iqbal, and then by extension about Faiz, because as I just said, Faiz's relationship to Iqbal is that not just of an interlocutor, but also of a presence. One of the great things that I like about our tradition of poetry, which is Urdu, Persian, Kashmiri even, that voices are not forgotten. The tradition is the voice. Oftentimes, we think, and in European literature and literary criticism, and some of it has affected the way we now assess our literatures, is that we think we want to find the voice that defines tradition. That is the voice that perhaps rises above tradition. So we talk about newness, we talk about innovation, we talk about experimentation. But the real power of our tradition, and that is what Faiz understood about Iqbal, is that you can never be bigger than the tradition, and that is the point. That is how a literary tradition.
Well, it's a great statement. Even though sociologists, they don't agree with this point, because by the changing time, certain things are changing. Actually, you try to absorb many things from many societies, and the tradition then becomes a weak thing. And secondly, what I want you to stress more is that where do you find the line of intersection between Iqbal and Faiz, even though they seem maybe invisible to the common man? That's what I want you to stress upon or focus upon.
Yeah, this is, in part, let me just respond to something that you said. It's true that there are these changing alignments of tradition. That is most certainly true, and it can become a thing very difficult to define.
Right.
But when it comes to what I'm referring here to specifically is the literary tradition that is inhabited in poetic forms.
Okay.
Right, and so it's a very specific thing that you can point to, and it is those who are aware of it. You are aware of it, or I've spent time learning about it. We take it for granted. We take it for granted that I could write a ghazal today, and I could be in conversation with Sadi, with Hafiz, with Rumi, with Bedil, with Ghalib, with Mir, with Iqbal, with Faiz, up till today. That attempt to be in conversation is a strength of our tradition.
That's where imagination can take you to any point.
It can take you to any point, but you have to have the solid means
of conversation and producing the things and presenting them in that light.
I'll give you an example. Hafiz is a poem, a shair, a bayt in Persian. He says, Shabe tari ke bi mein mojo gata bi chunin hail, kuja danan hale ma subh baran sahil. The night was dark. I was the waves were frightening. And it was a very scary time. What do the people who sit on the shores know of my pain? A
sort of mystic experience, actually, which you are revealing, right?
Yeah. So this is Hafiz ka shair. Now the reason I point to this is there is an Urdu shair that Iqbal has, and in that he is conversing with Hafiz without declaring it. He's conversing,
just pointing to this, so giving some reference of this shair, right?
And not just giving a reference, he's engaging and talking to him. He's responding. It's as if they're sitting around a gathering.
All right.
And he's responding across time. And he actually, and I say this, Iqbal in this one instance goes one step ahead of Hafiz, and I'll demonstrate that. So मैंने आपको ये शेर recite. Iqbal का एक शेर है, बनाया इश्क ने दरियाए ना पैदा करा मुझको, ये मेरी खुद निगहदारी मेरा साहिल न बन जाए. The way he's in conversation is, Hafiz made the point that the shore, Sahil, and the Samandar are distinct entities. Iqbal is saying, your shore and your sea are both within you. So he actually goes one step ahead in this. Of course, there is a sophistic background.
Exactly, yes. That's what.
So he actually engages Hafiz, and he, without declaring it, without shouting from the rooftops that I'm engaging Hafiz, without putting a footnote. And this engagement happens at two levels. One is the level of the ghazal. दोनों ghazal के शेर हैं, या ghazal के वज़न में जो अफ़ज़ान है. दूसरी बात ये है कि ये गजल के form में है, मतलब एक recognizable form, it's a recognizable form across time. Second is, he assumes that this Iqbal's share will stand on its own, and the moment someone realizes that there is a conversation happening,
Exactly. It's a sort of answer to.
yeah, and this was a very established jawab goi, जिसको हम
बिल्कुल.
call them, or istiqlal. People would use these sort of existing ash'ar to not just imitate but to respond, and it's almost having a conversation in real time over centuries. This is the strength of our tradition. And in this point, as I said, you see, Iqbal's so.
Do we find these types of things in Western poetry also?
We do. I mean, sure, but the way it's ingrained at a level in which the poet may also not realize in our tradition that he or she is actually in conversation with the whole tradition. In a sense, that whatever what the nature of especially the ghazal and masnavi even, but this poetic universe, if you want to enter this universe, you have to almost like enter an ecosystem. You need to start. Ghalib has a wonderful line about this. Ghalib का एक शेर है, बख्शे है जलवाए गुल, ज़ौक़े तमाशा गालिब, चश्म को चाहिए हर रंग में बाह हो जाना. Right, so, but you have to be in the garden to be able to look at the. So to be able to look at the gul,
the flowers, the scenery.
You know, when colonial officials started writing about Urdu poetry and Persian poetry, what were their big problems with it? Their big problems were that this is repetitive, this is ostentatious, this isn't, you know, there's no innovation in it. They keep repeating the same metaphors. Only to realize, I think, that is precisely what sets this poetic tradition apart. You see, it is to make sense, and it is to use, and it is to be in conversation through the use of established metaphors and see what you can do with that. And there's almost more poetic creativity.
So in other words, we can simply infer from this is that there's a great influence of tradition on your poetry and the way you start thinking and then narrating the whole thing. So creating something very abstract. So actually fusing your spiritual, I can say, experience and finding the fine words and then narrating something in your poetry, which makes it more beautiful and emphasizing.
In a way, yes, absolutely. But what I think we should stress, and what I try to stress in my research, is not necessarily experience as so much as an engagement with an existing body of ideas, words, metaphors, and also associations. This is a very important part of how poets of the early 20th century, for example,
exactly.
define tradition. You know, if you ask, if you look at texts where people talk about their sense of what tradition means, right? They will write about what tradition means to them, or indirectly, they will refer to how did they come about poetry. It's almost never about abstract ideas. It's about people. It's about methods. It's about particular moments in which they were in the presence of others. So one of the things I stress in my work, when I look at someone like Iqbal and his contribution, and we can talk about that and what Faiz also understood to be his contribution, is that eventually tradition, as how I see it in our cultural setup, and this is from the Persian world. One could talk about Iran, Afghanistan, South Asia, so on and so forth. It's essentially about the presence and absence of others. It's not about what I have cultivated myself to be. Rather, it's about how in the presence of others, in the sohbat of others, how did that lead me to this poetic intent? And this is throughout. This is not just in poetry. This is in tasawwuf, meaning Sufi orders. This is in fiqh, in the works of jurisprudential works. Oftentimes what happens is we look at these, this has been my sort of argument that I'm trying to develop, is that we look at tradition or riwayat or sunnah, as it was referred to in the 19th century. We look at those as basically an arrangement of arguments, abstract ideas. But when you really pay attention, pay close attention to how the practitioners of these various genres of Islamic learning, how did they think about what it means to be a part of tradition, you realize that it's intensely social. It's intensely relating to others.
That's great. Thank God that it does not come into the realm of science. Otherwise, we will go for looking mechanisms and it will lose all its beauty. And secondly, you were simply telling about the traditions, the company, and the so. But actually, what you gather from all that is simply a set of opinions which then generate your own vision. This is my opinion, and I can be wrong also. But let's move to one more segment of it is that when Faiz entered the literary scene through the progressive writers movement, Iqbal was the dominating intellectual presence. He was already there. How did Faiz negotiate Iqbal's massive shadow without merely imitating his voice? Because he could actually make his own vision, make his own identity and presence.
Yeah.
So that's very important.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this question. But maybe some of my answers might surprise you a little bit, or surprise our listeners. It's such a key question that I need to do some groundwork before I answer it. So you're absolutely right. The moment Faiz arrives in the literary scene, he started his career in college mushairas, as a lot of people would. And contrary to what a lot of people think, a lot of his major poems people think were written during his jail. But actually not. They were written, when he was maybe from 25 to 27, 28 years old, including all the famous ones you can think of. Mujhse pehli si mohabbat. The relationship between Faiz and Iqbal actually runs deeper in terms of interpersonal relationships. Faiz's recommendation letter for Government College Lahore was written by Iqbal because Faiz's father had known Iqbal from his time in England. Faiz's father was a very fascinating man. He was also one of the first biographers of Amir Abdul Rahman of Afghanistan. Faiz's father, that is, had spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, then had to come back and so on and so forth. Eventually, he had a very fascinating life, an exciting life. And would come back, and Faiz was born to one of his last wives. So Faiz was one of the younger ones in this sort of long list of family members. So Iqbal and Faiz talks about this. He had, of course, heard of Iqbal. He had met him on multiple occasions and so on and so forth. So interpersonally, there was this respect that they had had. Now, of course, in the domain of poetry, and this is the counterintuitive thing. People credit Iqbal for a lot of things. As your question also implies, he was the dominating voice in many ways. There were others, but you could put him as one of the leading Muslim intellectuals of the 20th century, and especially at that time. So we're talking 1920s. But one thing for which I think Iqbal should be given the most credit is that Iqbal began an argument and then became an argument.
Right.
Now you may ask, an argument for what? An argument for poetry as a form of knowledge that in the Islamic intellectual culture had to be reclaimed. To turn poetry as a form of knowledge as the linchpin of Islamic intellectual sovereignty. This is an underappreciated point, and I'm trying in my research to push this forward. What I mean by this is that Iqbal began an argument and became one. And this should be given credit for, and we should give him credit for that. What I mean by that is that if you notice, Iqbal has written very little prose.
Yeah.
This is quite interesting. He was fluent in 4 languages, at the very least. He had no shortage of publishers.
Anybody could have published.
The printing press was at its peak. And he has a writing career of about 40 years. That's a long time.
But he chose actually poetry.
He chose poetry, exactly.
To be his
now, that is not a coincidence. That's not a coincidence. And I think
it was deliberate.
That's the argument. That's what I say, that he first started the argument. He made an argument, then became one. He became the argument for poetry. He became the argument that at a very difficult time for Islamic intellectual culture in South Asia, which is after 1857 and a complete assault on Islamic institutions of learning after 1857 and leading up to the moment of colonial crisis and so on and so forth, Iqbal made a very conscious, it's my contention, that Iqbal made a very conscious attempt to center not ideas, but poetry as a form of knowledge that Muslims and broadly South Asians and parts of the colonized world, they could rely on this tradition again. They could rely on poetry as a form of knowledge to make the argument and to see and to express themselves and to deal with these ethical, political, and moral questions. Coming to Faiz, I think understood that because Faiz also wrote very little prose. Faiz has a longer writing career.
Then
He did.
Iqbal.
He wrote more than Iqbal did, but again, you can't really point to a lot of prose and not substantial amounts of prose. Iqbal Faiz also, I would say has been beautiful but less prose. There's some prison writings. There's some times that he wrote as the editor of Pakistan Pakistan Times and of Imroz. There's some editorials he wrote, but I wouldn't say that he spent much time on prose, even though he wrote more than Iqbal did. But he did understand. He did understand this point that this major service that Iqbal had done, which is to not just center poetry, but to center classical poetic forms. This is a very important point. If you look at a lot of scholarship today on Urdu and Urdu alone, the picture may seem a little blurry because we think that in one of the responses of 1857, post Ghalib and so on and so forth, with Hali and Shibli Nomani and Maulana and Muhammad Azad, we think that Urdu poetic landscape was changing rapidly, which it was, towards attacking the ghazal, towards critiquing classical forms, that these had been responsible for the quote-unquote decline and so on and so forth. But the interesting part is that when you put Urdu next to and compare in relative terms to other adjacent Islamic literary cultures, for example, Arabic, major poetic tradition, Persian, and Turkish, if you put them next to each other, Arabic today, a normative poem, a poem, if you imagine a poem today, you'll imagine a modernist poem, really, with some classical elements to it. But formally, it's a modernist poem. In Persian, it's mixed. You can have modernism,
as well as some elements of classical things.
Turkish is a bit more radical in the sense that they changed the script and so on and so forth. And today, to write a ghazal in Turkish, people do that, but it's like it's considered it's considered something.
Exactly, they have simply tried to evade those brackets and all the complications. Yes,
is the exception.
Urdu is still holding the traditional. Yes,
exactly. Even today, of course, there would have been modernist. I don't want to underappreciate the modernist experimentations and so on and so forth. But we know, looking at the larger scene, that even today, if anybody wants to be, even to this day, anybody wants to be acknowledged as a poet, ghazal aapko kehni padegi,
likhni padegi. Yeah.
So you see here, the situation is completely different. You have 3-4 adjacent literatures, and Urdu actually is the outlier in that, where the classical poetic forms, even though their shape has changed somewhat, remain normative, remain central. And I think Iqbal has to be credited for that. That's why I said that he started an argument at a time when his global contemporaries were moving towards experimentation of forms. Iqbal moved in the opposite direction. He became even more classical. And that's where I make the argument that I think in South Asia, especially when you look at Urdu and Persian materials, you realize that there's an attempt, a good attempt, a solid attempt by someone like Iqbal to center poetic form, classical poetic forms, and make them the linchpin of intellectual sovereignty, of thinking on our own terms. And that service is what I think benefits Faiz, because what is Faiz known for, both within the Urdu writing circles and literary scholarship and abroad? He is known really for the way in which he dealt with poetic form. He's considered the most classical of the people he is compared with often, which is Noon Rashid, Miraji, and later on, you may have Majid Amjad and so on and so forth. These are sort of the people that he's often put with. But to me, Faiz's debt, really, which he also acknowledges to Iqbal, is not really a debt to Iqbal, but it's a debt to Iqbal's foregrounding, the poetic form that gave strength to the progressive writers movement from which Faiz arrived and came up, to rely on these classical poetic forms. It's a very interesting thing, because usually you may expect that people who were coming from and approaching, and there were many people like that in the progressive writers movement, but most of the progressive writers movements' shining stars, and even the lesser known people, poets, were all writing in classical form. It was the modernists who were experimenting with form. It's an interesting thing. So while progressive writers may have critiqued some elements of classical intellectual religious tradition, they had to rely on the service that Iqbal had done. And Faiz, I think, understood that very well. He
So
never
Iqbal
let go.
was like a great giant on whose shoulders they were simply standing and trying to look very farther and farther.
Yes, but I would slightly twist the metaphor. I think Iqbal, I describe Iqbal as a presence. He is both an apparition and a presence in especially Faiz, but I think in all of the poetic tradition, Urdu poetic tradition after him. The reason is that the reason because he's a presence is because I think he was a major argument that allowed poets like Faiz to rely, and not just to rely, but to happily engage this ghazal tradition, that happily engage the broader Islamic intellectual culture that stretches about 7 to 800 years, without being self-conscious about it. So that in that sense, I think it's a very important important thing to recognize, and also to this is again I'm going back to the reframing. We need to sort of look at these figures not as either distinct from each other or completely belonging to different times, which they do belong to different times, but not comparing them as if there was some sort of a break that now we need to sort of bridge
that gap, right?
Because the texts themselves, the poets themselves, are telling you repeatedly that we are speaking in one voice.
Fine. So this was the structural analogy which you were presenting. We will simply now focus on the deviations of their narratives by asking, how does Faiz's secularization of sacred imagery such as Karbala or the Day of Judgment in Hum Dekhenge compare to Iqbal's spiritualization of political and social life? Because you see, the mental setup was of these great giants was totally different, which I personally feel like that.
To some extent, the question of secularization of of the image, for example, in Hum Dekhenge, which is famously
right,
alludes to and speaks to the imagery of Rosa Qiyamah in the Quran. I don't know if I would put it as secularization in some sense, because that implies that when Iqbal is referring to those things, he's referring to them with a different objective in mind than Faiz is. I don't think that distinction holds. I think rather that when Faiz is speaking, it's more a distinction in style than it is in intention or objective. Because Iqbal, going back to the Danishgah, being a university,
right?
Iqbal is quite contrary to what a lot of people think. He's not always, just like beating you on the head and telling you what to do. He can be very funny. Iqbal can be very funny. He can be very gentle. At many examples, he's very gentle. He can be quite bebak. Can be called quite beniyaz, and famously when he's referring to God. And that's not a bebaki that one has with a stranger. It's the bebaki you have with someone you're quite intimate with.
Exactly.
Which is what the shikwa and the jawab shikwa do. There are many examples like that. But the distinction is in style. Faiz, I think, is what we make. What if I had to point to Faiz's poetic voice? One of the criticisms that Faiz faced by his fellow critics, which I think has some merit to some extent, that Faiz's voice can be a little limited. His style doesn't have that many colors as someone like Iqbal has, or Mir is a champion of that. Mir can have so many different voices in a single ghazal. Faiz was often critiqued for this, and he was critiqued for a lot of unfair reasons too, just like Iqbal was in his time. But this was one of the criticisms I think can hold some water. Although I can respond to it if you allow me to do that.
You are
brought out the criticism. That criticism comes from a kind of European, some European ideas about literary criticism, which is that a poet must always keep reinventing themselves. So this focus on individual voice. I think Faiz, yes, he can be slightly, he can come across as repetitive, but it's never devoid of magic. It's never devoid of being effective.
Yeah, mesmerizing always.
It's mesmerizing always. So, one can critique him for those reasons. But yeah, his poetry has a certain amount of, on this question, a distinction in style. He's a bit more mellow. He's a bit more. Faiz का एक शेर है, which I think gets to the heart of the matter. He has a poem, इनका एक शेर है कि गमे जहां हो रुखे यार हो कि दस्ते अदू, गमे जहां हो
रुखे
रुखे
यार
यार हो कि दस्ते अदू, सुलूक जिससे किया हमने आशिकाना किया. It's one of those, उनका एक इस तरह का शेर था. Oftentimes poets will sometimes, once in a while, have a शेर that captures their aspiration, their poetic aspiration, their poetic personality. I think this is one of those. So the ashikana nature of Faisa. But what's very critical is he doesn't say that I have मैंने आशिकी की है सबसे. Suluk ashikana.
हाँ, सलूक आशिकाना.
Which is a very fine but important distinction, especially when you keep when you realize the importance of husn suluk in Islamic ethical tradition. In fact, Ashfaq Ahmad, the major television personality and a preacher in Pakistan, used to run a very important show,
yeah.
and was known to have a great command of Urdu prose. Has a wonderful little essay about Faiz called Faiz Ek Malamati Sufi, in which he points out, I would really recommend people to read it, in which he points out something important and interesting. He says, Faiz and I have had our disagreements and so on and so forth. And he says that there are people that if I were to refer to him as anything, I would refer to him as a Malamati Sufi, though he was not a part of the Sufi order, though he, is said to have all these popular perceptions about a complicated relationship with religion and faith and so on and so forth. But he nevertheless points out that I would call him a Malamati Sufi because he is a Sufi. If there were to be an order, a Sufi or tariqa, in which people would be inducted due to their husn saluk.
So Faiz will be a yes. I got your point exactly.
Right, and again, the way I mentioned that this is all a conversation across tradition, and then you think of Iqbal ka aapko sher yaad aayega, misra adab pehla karina hai mohabbat ke karina.
So this how you can simply relate these two things. I'll be starting asking you some personal questions. For example, if you were teaching a course at Harvard bridging Iqbal and Faiz for today's generation, what central lesson would you want students to take away from the role of literature in times of political crisis?
Well, I am going to be teaching one course which will have some of these elements. So it's broadly on advanced Urdu literature. A central lesson, keeping Iqbal and Faiz in mind, I think would be that you must champion your own vocabulary.
Right.
What I mean by that is speak in your language. Speak in the language that not just you have inherited, but when everybody else is telling you to abandon that language.
That's exactly what's happening, right?
You must give yourself to that language. Allow it to bring out perspectives in you that, as Ghalib says, देखना तकरीर की लज्जत की जो उसने कहा, मैंने ये जाना कि गोया ये भी मेरे दिल में. So this idea that this too is in my heart, it comes from giving yourself to this language, to remaining to staying put when the world is telling you it's not going to work. You see, this I really think, and Iqbal and Faiz in many senses inhabited different times, but they both belong to what I call the terrain of poetry, Zameen-e-Sher. They were both proud inhabitants of their roots. Of that shared terrain. We have this happened in the 19th, but really in the 20th century, that we have, in a sense, nationalized literatures. Again, a European import that we have just taken for granted. The idea that someone writing in Kabul, in Isfahan, in Samarkand, in Lahore, in Delhi, in Dhaka, that they could be writing in different languages, but they belong to one tradition. That is my central lesson, that perhaps for a lot of what's happening today, we may be well served to speak the same language, to belong to one tradition. Not speak the same language literally, but to understand that what Faiz and Iqbal and figures like this do is that they remind you
Yeah, you
There are
actually
ways of inhabiting space beyond these received ideas of nations and so on and so forth.
actually simply trying to get out what is very intrinsic in you. You see, several distinguished Indian parliamentarians with Ivy League credentials have made lasting impacts on Indian governance and policy. Given your academic journey through UPenn and Harvard, and your deep focus on South Asian geopolitics, would you ever consider transitioning from academics to active public service or politics in Jammu and Kashmir? It may be quite personal, but
No, I mean, we're talking of Faiz and
and we are
Iqbal
sure
and,
it's a rather a poles apart question.
no,
A
no,
big,
I appreciate it. I mean, to be honest,
you see, because I can quote some names coming to my mind, like Dr. Sujata Bose, who is now senior colleague at Harvard, and you have got Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Kapil Sibal, Ashwini Vaishnav, and so many other guys coming from such elite universities, and then I can say diving deep in politics.
sure, yeah, that's absolutely true. One of my a poet I really like these days, poet named Zafar Iqbal. उनका एक शेर है, तो बेहतर होगा मैं उस शेर से इसका जवाब दूं.
बिल्कुल.
मैंने कब दावा किया था सर बसर बाकी हूं मैं. मैंने कब दावा किया था सर बसर बाकी हूं मैं. पेशे खिदमत हूं तुम्हारे जिस कदर बाकी हूं मैं. And so to that, I mean, look, I mean, we were talking about people like Faiz, we were talking about people like Paul. They never shied from politics, and I'd like to think that whatever I have tried to study and given, my 20s to it, and so on and so forth, that I wouldn't shy away when I feel that I have something to offer as well.
Wow, that's great. देखने वालों की खिदमत में यह अर्ज करना चाहूंगा कि डॉक्टर साहब एक शायर भी है, तो जाहिर सी बात है कि आखिर में हम इनकी गजल सुनना चाहेंगे. तो डॉक्टर साहब, ये हमारी रिक्वेस्ट है कि आप सुनाइए हमें गजल.
जी, बहुत मैं नीम शायर हूँ वैसे जब हम अपनी रिवायत की बात करते हैं. बहरहाल उससे पहले मैंने क्योंकि गालिब के कुछ अशार जरूर इकबाल और गालिब के सुनाए, तो फैज साहब का एक शेर मैं सुना देता हूँ.
बिल्कुल.
जो मुझे बहुत पसंद भी है, और उनका ज्यादा मशहूर शेर है नहीं वो, लेकिन होना चाहिए. इट इज ऑन द नेचर ऑफ पावर पॉलिटिक्स, और वो मैंने दिल से लगाया हुआ है. वो शेर ये है कि सरे खुसरो से ताजे कच कुलाही छिन भी जाता है. सरे खुसरो से ताजे कच कुलाही नाजे कच कुलाही छिन भी जाता है.
नाजे कच कुलाही छिन.
सरे खुसरो से नाजे कच कुलाही छिन भी जाता है. कुलाहे खुसरवी से बुए सुल्तानी नहीं जाती. And I won't explain this because I think the power of the share is for us to go looking
for it. Right.
अब मैं बिल्कुल, अब हमने अपने बुजुर्ग का नाम लेके मैं आपको कुछ जरा
अपनी अपनी तकलीफ के
तो तमहीद के लिए मैं जरा I would switch to Urdu for a little bit.
Yeah, बिल्कुल.
तमहीद के लिए मैं एक गजल के चंद शेर और फिर दो मुख्तसर ताज़ा गजलें. बिल्कुल बिल्कुल. कि और वो इसी जमीन में मैंने शेर कहा है, गजल कही है जो मैंने फैज साहब का आपको शेर सुनाया है, इसीलिए मैं भी वो उस जमीन में मैंने गजल कही थी कि गुलों से बाग की हालत तो पहचानी नहीं जाती. गुलों से बाग की हालत तो पहचानी नहीं जाती, मगर हम कम निगाहों की ये नादानी नहीं जाती. गुलों से बाग की हालत तो पहचानी नहीं जाती, मगर हम कम निगाहों की ये नादानी नहीं जाती. सुबह बारान साहिल जब मुअर्रिख हों समंदर के. सुबह बारान साहिल जब मुअर्रिख हों समंदर के. दलील खस्ता कश्ती की कभी मानी नहीं जाती. वाह. छुपा कर रख लिया है क्यों फलक ने खामाए पर्दा. छुपा कर रख लिया है क्यों फलक ने खामाए पर्दा. कहानी ये दमे तहरीर क्यों जानी नहीं जाती. इसका एक और शेर सुनने के खबर क्या हो कबाए अंजुमे नाचाक को इनकी. खबर क्या हो कबाए अंजुमे नाचाक को इनकी. मोहब्बत में लगे दागों की उरियानी नहीं जाती. तो ये एक फैजाब की जमीन में गजल थी. तो मैं बाकी दो ताज़ा गजलें हैं, तो वो मुख्तसर सी मैं बिल्कुल मुझे याद नहीं है, तो मैं जरा उसको जी. कूचाए शहरे वफा की अब हवा कुछ और है. कूचाए शहरे वफा की अब हवा कुछ और है. कह रहे हैं लोग कुछ लेकिन हुआ
कुछ और है.
कह रहे हैं लोग कुछ लेकिन हुआ कुछ और है. आशना अल्फाज लर्जा हैं दरो दीवार पर. आशना अल्फाज लर्जा हैं दरो दीवार पर. गौर से देखे कोई इन पर लिखा
कुछ और.
एक भरी महफिल में पूछा उसने जब वजह गुरेज,
हम्म,
एक भरी महफिल में पूछा उसने जब वजह गुरेज, हमको कहना कुछ पड़ा
लेकिन
वरना गिला कुछ
बिल्कुल
और,
और है, सही बात
हमको कहना कुछ पड़ा वरना गिला कुछ और।
और है।
मौज दरिया देखकर साहिल पजीरों की तरफ, मौज दरिया देखकर साहिल
साहिल
पजीरों की तरफ, खुश है कि आबे रवां का मरहला कुछ और।
हम्म,
इसका आखिरी शेर है कि मैं अलम के तखल्लुस से लिखता हूँ,
अच्छा।
ऐन वाला।
हम्म,
वक्त हिजरत खुल गया ये राज पल भर में अलम, वक्त हिजरत खुल
खुल
गया
गया
ये
ये
राज
राज,
पल भर में अलम, नगमाए बुलबुल अलग बांगे दरा कुछ
कुछ
और।
और है। बहुत खूब, बहुत खूब।
जी। और अब आखिर में एक बिल्कुल ही ताज़ा सी गज़ल है, तो उसके चंद शेर में और उस पर हम इत्तेफाक करेंगे, क्योंकि हमने ट्रेडिशन की बात की, रिवायत की बात की, आवाज़ों की बात की, कि एक आवाज़ में कितनी सारी आवाज़ें हमारी रिवायत में पिन्हा होती हैं, तो उसकी नज़र ये शेर, ये चंद शेर। गुजरी रुतों की खुशबुएं अब तक गुलों में हैं, गुजरी
रुतों
रुतों
की
की
खुशबू,
खुशबुएं अब तक गुलों में हैं, बिछड़े हुओं के अक्स मेरी महफिलों में हैं,
बिछड़े हुओं के अक्स
अक्स
मेरी
मेरी
महफिलों
महफिलों
में
में
है।
हैं। लौट आएंगे जो रास ना आएंगी मंजिलें, लौट आएंगे जो रास
न
ना
आएंगी
आएंगी
मंजिलें,
मंजिलें, दो चार ऐसे लोग तेरे काफिलों में हैं,
है
दो चार ऐसे
ऐसे
लोग
लोग
तेरे
तेरे
काफिलों
काफिलों
में
में।
हैं। नाजुक मिजाज शोख जबी चश्मे पुरफुसूं, नाजुक मिजाज शोख जबी चश्मे पुरफुसूं, ऐसे भी कुछ हसी मेरे कातिलों
तुम
में
में है
हैं,
ओ,
ऐसे भी कुछ हसी
सीम
मेरे
मेरे
कातिलों
कातिलों
में
में
हैं।
है।
इसका आखिरी शेर के चाहे कि बज़ में यार हो या खेमाए अदू, चाहे कि बज़ में यार हो या खेमाए अदू, इज़्ने खुदा से हम तमाम निस्बतों में हैं।
ओ, बहुत खूब, बहुत खूब। दिल को बहुत खुशी होती है जब हम ये पाते हैं कि हमारे अपने इस मिट्टी से, इस कश्मीर से ऐसे गुल निकलते हैं जिनकी खुशबू दूर दूर तक फैल जाती है।
Thank you so much to the Educational Cosmos channel. And I am quite impressed with the work that they're doing, and in fact, would like to thank them for introducing such interesting conversations based in Kashmir on these really universal topics. And I'm quite, frankly, excited to be a part of the conversation in a few minutes. And I hope you'll enjoy. I hope you'll continue watching this channel and like it and subscribe it and spread the word.
सच में बहुत ही खुशकिस्मत है हम के हमारे यहाँ ऐसे लोग हैं, ऐसे छोटे स्कॉलर है, यंग स्कॉलर है, जिन्होंने हार्वर्ड के दरवाजों को खटखटाया। बाकी अस्सलाम।